The ding is my favorite bit. Welcome back to DevOps. Hopefully you are in the right room. We are here for a lazy person's guide to building REST clients. We have Ash Speck presenting for us. Ash is a cybersecurity engineer with a background in medical device testing, chronically incapable of saying no to interesting projects or weird technical problems. They are also allergic to writing scripts more than 300 lines long. Involved in a number of pride networks, they're passionate about expanding queer representation in cybersecurity and engineering. They still haven't figured out what DevSecOps is, and at this point are too afraid to ask. Welcome, Ash. Take it away.
Hello. Oh, cool. I'm coming through the speakers. Great. Hi, everyone. I'm Ash. Welcome to my talk. Setting some context. REST APIs are pretty ubiquitous. Really useful way to send and receive data. Writing them's super boring. So I set out to make my life much harder one day and find a way to make the actual writing them a bit interesting. Walk you through my weird problem-solving journey. Yeah, this talk kind of came about from last year's PyCon, which I semi-snuck into because there was a really boring corporate cybersecurity conference that work had sent me to next door. Hated it. And bumped into a friend, and they were like, oh, that might be interesting. So yeah, a little bit about me. My pronouns are they, them. I didn't spend thousands of dollars avoiding the horror of assigned gender to be gendered, so please respect that. Things I do for fun: rock climbing, photography, cooking, sewing, writing. As I said in my bio, I was originally a biomedical engineer, but these days I work as a security engineer. For people that don't know cybersecurity, makes me a bit of a cyber plumber, or a really overpaid sysadmin. Yeah. So, disclaimer, I'm not a software engineer. My only formal qualification involved putting ping pong balls on amputees and making them walk around a room. So I only learned what software design patterns were a month ago. So if you have any feedback on any of the code in this talk, please let me know. I really want to be better at my job. My colleagues would also probably really like me to be better at my job. Anyone who wants to hear the amputee story, buy me a coffee sometime. It's kind of fun. And a little bit of an overview. Going to touch on REST clients. What are they? How do I interact with them? Very brief introduction to what dunders are. And then the meat and potatoes is kind of going to be like how I solved this or how I made my life more difficult in order to make it less boring. So REST clients, or representational state transfer, it's a bit of a mouthful. Actually originally started as a software architectural style in the late 90s, early 2000s, I think. Interestingly, most REST APIs do not conform to the software architectural style, which is kind of odd. So these days, REST is commonly used as a bit of a catch-all term for any kind of system that you're grabbing data from a web server and bringing it to your client. And so for the purpose of this talk, we'll be talking about just the API. For the example, I'll be using VirusTotal, partly because I'm a security engineer and there is no security operations team on Earth that probably doesn't use it in some capacity. And secondly, because it's really well documented, you can go online, check out the API doco. There's also a free tier. You can sign up for an API key if you'd like. Yeah. So a REST client, how does it work? Your client will usually want some data from a server, and so it will go send a HTTPS, not HTTP, please don't use that. Request to the server, usually with some kind of authorization, authentication header to it, commonly an API key. And then your server will vomit up a blob of data. It can be any kind of format. VirusTotal uses JSON, so that's what we're using for this talk. And then a very, very, very brief introduction into dunders. Most of you are probably aware of what they are. When I was writing this talk, I learned that their official term is actually a system-defined name. Yeah, I'd only ever heard them as dunders and magic methods for years. Two trailing and leading underscores, hence double underscore dunder, feels a bit self-explanatory. Defined within the interpreter, but they allow for custom classes to define specific behavior. I think most people's introduction is probably going to be the init function, which is used to define how new instances of a class are initialized. Yeah, so diving in, we get into our problem case. So you got to write a bunch of clients. Say you've got, well, put yourself in my shoes, you've been hired into a new role, you've got to write a bunch of software, you're not familiar with Python, and you've got an application that you need to bring a bunch of data into yesterday. Yeah, and so you're going, how can I write a lot less code and get this done really fast? It probably didn't end up making my life much faster, but hey, let's see. So as a reference point, this is a regular request in Python. You fire up your request library, you import your libraries, you pull an API key, and you send a request. This is kind of what we want to be automating, right? So you get a response that looks like this. Again, a JSON blob. You're probably all fairly familiar with what they look like. Not going to go into the details of JSON, but yeah. So you go, I don't want to have to write that code over and over and over again for every request I make. So maybe you go, wow, this abstraction thing is really great. I'm going to write a function, and then I only have to write that code once, and then I can call that function as many times as I need. Look at that. I can get all those IPs. Wonderful. Still kind of annoying. So maybe you go, why don't I create a class? Python's class system is amazing. You want to group common behavior. Also, we can do subclasses. I'm a big fan of the request session. It brings a lot of the functionality that we want to be using into this. You don't have to write the actual request itself. The people that wrote the request library are bloody brilliant. They're much smarter than me. But at the same time, or I should say, you want to call this, so pretty standard process. You get an instance of your class, you call the methods on the class, you get your data, groundbreaking stuff. Bit of an Easter egg. First person to come to me with what that hash is, I'll buy a drink. But you're still having to write a method for each piece of functionality. So each endpoint on the server that you want, you're writing a method for. I'm really lazy. I hate writing more code than I have to. I hate doing more work than I have to. And especially if it's boilerplate and I'm not solving any problems that feel like fun. So how can we make this a bit more interesting? And more specifically, can I create methods and attributes without having to write them all? That's a really good question. Let's see what happens. So let's strip those methods out of our class. So we've just got our init function. And then let's see what happens when we try this little part in the main section. Surprise, surprise, we throw an error. Great. This case, it's an attribute error. That's really good to know. And because we're throwing an error, we can say the interpreter's doing something to catch that. So if it wasn't catching the error, you'd throw a seg fault, which is not ideal, trying to access something in memory that doesn't exist. So we're seeing an attribute error, and the object has no attribute popular threat categories. So that kind of begs the question, how does Python access attributes and methods? Yeah, and one of the wonderful things about Python is it's super well documented. I really, really love the reference documentation. So you go to the documentation, specifically chapter 3, which is probably what I'll be, well, no, definitely what I'll be referring to. It's really, really good. And you go to the attribute access section, and there are five, this is kind of 4 fingers because climbing, methods that define attribute access. They are getAttr, getAttribute, setAttr, delAttr, and dear. Seems like the first 3 are going to be the most useful for us. We've only read the documentation saying that those methods exist. We haven't actually read what they do. We don't need to do that, right? So best way to find out is to write code and see what they do. So we override, or actually overload. I learned last week that overloading and overriding are actually 2 different things. So it's interesting little factoid. So we overload our 3 functions. We overload getAttr, getAttribute, and setAttr. You can probably see here that I'm using the superclass. Turns out if you don't do that, you break instantiation. Yeah, so that was one thing that I learned when doing this, that if you overload the wrong method, you can kind of break a bunch of things. So avoiding that where possible. So cool. This is what our class looks like. And let's go back to what we were doing before, and let's try and access these attributes that don't exist. So previously we threw attribute errors. Let's see what happens now. Oh, we get a bunch of logs. I'm a security person. I'm a huge nerd. I fucking love logs. You guys probably don't. And so I do have a handy dandy kind of janky flowchart to show what's going on here. But before I get to that, you can see that those functions are being called, and they seem to be being called in a specific order. So we get to our kind of janky flowchart, and this is what it looks like. Whenever you attempt attribute access, the method getAttribute is called first. Execution order matters, because you can break it otherwise. And if the attribute exists, it'll return the attribute. If not, it will attempt to call getAttr. If you haven't defined getAttr, it will throw an attribute error. If you do, it will call getAttr and whatever the functionality you've popped in there. If not, again, it'll raise an attribute error. So if we go back to some of the code that we had written just before, where was I? You can see that I've called setAdder in there. So we're actually setting that attribute and value. So we've just done name here for the example, but it doesn't really matter what you put in there. So where were we? GetAdder. So what is GetAdder and how does it work specifically? Again, documentation. It's beautiful. You should read more of it. You should write a lot of it. Called when the default attribute access fails with an attribute error. The object class itself does not provide this method. Cool. What's an object class? Again, this is something that I learned when I was writing the talk. Object class is the ultimate base class of all other classes. It has methods that are common to all instances of Python. What does that mean? So it means that every object in Python has the methods that are attached to the base class. There are other dunders that exist, but ones that are not attached to the ultimate base class don't define default behavior for objects. So because getAdder is not on the base class, that means that we can do whatever the hell we want with it, theoretically, without breaking things. So no predefined behavior for getAdder. We have control over what it does. In this case, we used setAdder to set our attributes. So, and that's how we got those logs working. And that's kind of fun. We can start playing with things. We're setting our attributes, but how do we get them to give me data? That's a good question. Let's try calling it. Now it's not an attribute, it's a method. Technically still objects though. So let's try this and see what happens. Cool. Another error. Great. I love errors. They give us a bunch of information. They tell us what's going on underneath. In this case, we're getting a type error. So non-type object is not callable. Yeah, cool. What does that mean? Let's go to the documentation. So I don't even go to the documentation. I go to Google and I type in, how do I make a Python object callable? I fight for my life with a generic AI response, realize that I burnt through several bottles of water, feel a little bit bad, click on the first link, and this is what I get. So instances of an arbitrary class can be made callable by defining a call method in their class. Cool. What's the call method? Called when an instance is called. Kind of a bit circular there. But again, the object class does not provide this method. Great. So that means we can probably continue playing around with this and hopefully, again, not break anything. Fingers crossed. I haven't broken anything with this. If anyone has, please let me know. That would be really interesting to know how you broke it. I really like breaking things. I think that's why I ended up in cybersecurity. Where were we? So let's write some more code. Let's pop this or create a call method, see what happens. In this case, we'll do something really simple. We'll just send a log every time it calls itself. We'll throw a log when a endpoint is created. Note, I've created a new class. Again, this is just kind of grouping some common behavior together to make things a little bit easier. So any of the endpoint related behavior, formatting the URLs, grabbing the data is going to pop in there. Our virus total will still handle our requests. So note, we've changed getAdder. So we're setting the attribute, but we're also returning it. There is a slight error in this. This will actually create two versions of it. So I have fixed this in my GitHub repo since I actually popped the slide in. But anyway, yeah. So we're returning it. Returning it is really important. If you don't return it, you'll throw another error. Again, something that I learned as I was messing around with this. Otherwise, you would have to create the attribute and then call it in another line. But if we do this, we can do it all in a single line, and less code is great. So this didn't work before. At this point in the talk, you're probably going, well, it didn't work before. You've done the example, so it will probably work this time. And yes, you'd be right. I'm not going to show you more logs. You're probably a bit sick of them. You're going to have to trust me that this actually works. Or you could run it, see if it does, find out. If it doesn't, come be like, well, actually, Ash, you just told me some bullshit. Yeah, so we get to that point and we go, okay, it's calling. Oh, actually, I did show logs. Should have walked through my talk a few more times to remember what slides are in it. So it's working. I believe the proverb is we are cooking with gas. Some interesting things to note. You can see that the virus total object class is common for all of them. I suppose that's interesting for me. Some people might go, that seems really boring. So you can see it's all pointing to the same object at the same memory address. great. It's nice if you want to be a bit more efficient. So let's start making some requests. We have created attributes out of thin air, and well, I suppose we've created methods out of thin air. That's wonderful. So let's modify our call method. Let's just throw a really simple request in there. Note that I'm formatting the URL. I'm really familiar with the VirusTotal documentation, so you are going to have to trust me that this tends to be how you access an endpoint on VirusTotal. You can look at the documentation itself. Other APIs may not necessarily follow that format, and there is some jiggery-pokery if you're doing this for a bunch of them, in that your class does need to accommodate for that, or you need to create other versions of it for each API. Yeah, so we do that, and then we can do things like this. There's no method IP addresses, there's no method domains. JSON.dumps is an actual method. It would print a nicely formatted JSON blob. I'm not going to show you my console for this. Again, you've probably seen enough JSON blobs to last a lifetime if you're already here at the conference. Yeah. So we can expand on it. This is great. Note in the previous one we were defaulting to we were only doing GET requests. In this one we will default to a GET request. You can throw some quags in there, attach it as a method equals whatever. We can modify our URL based on the data that we're feeding it. I really like quags. It's great. Problem with this, your linter might not like it. Doesn't make code super readable, but you get it out really quickly. So I'm not sure whether this is super suitable for production, because you'd write this, you'd prototype it, you would definitely come back to refactor it to make sure that the documentation and the code was really good so that other people would know what to do next time. That would definitely happen, right? Yeah, so this gives us the ability to kind of throw different methods at it that we might want. Yeah. So essentially we get to this. So I know that the VirusTotal search endpoint basically allows you to throw any data that you want at it, and it will just run a very generic query. But what we would get to here is that Python code up the top would be equivalent of that curl request down on the bottom, which is great. We can throw a bunch of stuff. We don't have to be writing a whole bunch of methods. It ends up being that class and endpoint class is probably about 80 to 100 lines of code, and you've got something working. And then you can feed that through to your, or hopefully to your web application in my case. Yeah. We want to expand on it. What further functionality do we want our client to have? Well, obviously this is going to depend on your use case. In mine, we want it to be able to handle different request types. Cool, we've kind of done that. Probably want it to handle data in the URI and the request body. If it's a GET request, it's probably just request parameters in the URI. If it's a POST or a delete or a PUT, you've probably got some kind of body that you're sending data to. You probably want to check that the data that you're sending and the method that you're using on the endpoint is valid. You probably want to handle the response. And if you've got other people that may be using this code, maybe you want to turn it into a library and maybe make their lives not too painful. Maybe you want to wrap those known endpoints into some nicely defined methods, which we were kind of hoping to avoid initially, but we got our prototype out, we got some kind of working thing. We can show our boss that, look, yeah, it actually works. And then we want to make their lives easier. So let's have a look at what that might look like. Again, this is an example of how I did it. If you have other ideas, I'll leave that as an exercise for the reader, I guess. It's one way to offload it. So we modify our call. Maybe we validate the method. Maybe we check that there's something required. We're checking our args. Maybe we have some kind of response handler. What might those look like? I'll touch on how I did that for this specific API. So we've modified our endpoint class. We've got some methods and required. It's probably not the best naming convention, but please forgive me for this. Yeah, when we instantiate it, it might look like this. So you go, oh, wow, that's a list in a dictionary. Great. What am I doing with those? So we want to validate our method. We just check to see if the method is in the list that we've attached to the endpoint. And it's really groundbreaking stuff here, right? We might do the same for our dictionary. So I am speeding through these really fast. I apologize for that. Again, we just make sure that whatever parameter is attached to the or to the method entry in the dictionary. I would love to see alternative ways to do this. just out of curiosity if you've got recommendations or better things for me. Yeah, so we want to wrap it. Again, really complex stuff going on here. I love when the doc strings are longer than the method itself. We're literally just returning our predefined method, or our non-predefined method. There's also an error here. If you notice that I was returning the JSON blob in the previous one, this is also returning the JSON blob of the JSON blob. It would probably throw an error. I fixed this in my actual repo, but not for this particular example. And then we might have a response handler. I really love Python 3.10 and the fact that you can do pattern matching like this. It's genuinely my favorite thing. You have to bring me screaming and crying into a version less than 3.10. Really annoying if you've written this code on your own machine and then you try and deploy and your boss goes, actually, it's a Red Hat server and the only version of Python it has is like 3.6 and you have to refactor it all. Definitely not something that's happened to me at like Friday at 5:30, which was not my fault. I didn't choose to deploy it then. I just, yeah, I just lodged the pull request. Yeah, so where do we go from here? Well, you write more clients, you play with these methods. I would really love to know other ways to use this. I'm sure people have done similar things to do this that aren't necessarily related to REST clients. There's almost certainly a lot more use cases. I'd be really shocked if I had come up with the only one. Yeah, so I sped through that very quickly because I'm quite nervous and I speak really, really quickly when I'm nervous. So thank you for coming. My GitHub, my Blue Sky, and my NeoCities links are up there if you ever want to read or look at my terrible code or my terrible posting or my terrible writing. They're not actually that terrible. I hope people have complimented them sometimes. Yeah, thank you for coming. Ooh, a mug. I'm happy to take questions if people have them. I can't necessarily guarantee I'll be able to answer them.
We have a couple of minutes for questions because thank you for catching us up because this is great. No one ever goes quickly and makes us catch up time. Like, it's DevOps. How are you making things better?
Yeah,
Thank
I'm
you so
nervous
much
and I speak
for
really
speaking.
quickly.
This is tremendous. I will do a runner around the room to please use the microphone when you ask them questions. Ooh. We have one over here.
G'day. Just wondering if you've looked at OpenAPI at all and
Yes.
schemas.
Yes, so VirusTotal has a nice OpenAPI specification. I do know that there are tools where if you feed it an OpenAPI spec, it will spit out a client for you. I have had issues with those before in Python and in Rust. They really don't work well in Rust. Yeah. And I wasn't really thinking about the end schema. Most of what my work involves is turning JSON blobs into slightly different JSON blobs. Having to write out a full schema or have one pre-generated for me is usually a waste of time because I don't, usually a time limitation. But yes.
Any more questions?
Cool.
Well, please join me in thanking Ash for a tremendous talk.